Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fuck It All podcast, a conversation with modern women redefining what it means to have it all. Today, I am sitting down with a new friend and one of my favorite modern women, Catie Ivey. Catie is a sales leader. She is a wife. She is a mom to a golden retriever. She is an Atlantan. And what I love most is Catie is a huge advocate for getting more women into sales and sales leadership. So what you're going to hear today is a lot of our conversation centering around women in business and specifically women in sales. For those of you who know me personally, know that's the world I came from. But we're also going to get into, who we are as people and some of Catie's stories about times that she said, hey, this may be what the storybook says of it all, but this is the life I'm leading, and where those divergent paths were. So with that, let's jump in. Catie, welcome to the show, and I'm so glad to have you.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm stoked to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So Catie and I met, honestly, a couple weeks ago. We are both a part of a professional women's group, and we decided to get socially distanced outdoor coffee. So everybody be sure we were safe, but we did. We had face-to-face coffee. And Catie, I don't know about you, but it was honestly the highlight maybe of my month, just to see a new human outside in the real world.
Yeah, I haven't done a lot of meeting people in real life or in person these last number of months. I've made some really cool new connections and friendships virtually, but it was very fun to actually sit down outside at our local coffee shop and have a conversation that wasn't over video or cell phone. So I loved it.
Oh my gosh, I know. So Catie, I love to always start these conversations with just a shared definition because, right, I think in our minds, everybody has a picture of what does it mean to have it all. And I want to know from you, maybe it's your original definition or maybe it's the definition you have today, but how do you define what it means to have it all?
First of all, I love the premise and everything that you dig into on the podcast. Literally like my eyes lit up when you started sharing with me just 2 weeks ago, kind of your vision and what you were building here. And I think it's such an important topic. And it's definitely one for me that has evolved and morphed over time. I know we'll get into some of my personal stories and things that have kind of shaped me as a human being and a professional and a wife and all the different layers there. But for me, when I think of having it all, it's very much deciding what I want to have and then knowing that I can go out and get it. For me, it also means being willing to be brave and do things differently and not feel like I have to follow just this kind of set concrete path. I think that for many of us, it's not just women, but I think especially more so for women because the proverbial biological clock and kind of the way that we have our life set up into these chapters and how fixated we are on age and aging. I think it's very easy for us to march down this path of I need to do this by this date and this by this date and this by this date. And then our definition of what having it all kind of has to fit nicely inside of those boxes. So for me, when I think of what having it all means for me, I think that I can have just about anything that I want, but it's got to be me actually making the choice and deciding that that's kind of what I want to focus on and the direction I want to go.
Oh, there's so many good things to unpack there. I'll start with just the most obvious around the timing or biological clock. I think as women, it starts early, right? It's especially I think you and I have this in common, very achievement oriented. So we were probably those, hit all our marks in high school, going into college, and we'll talk more about that. But for me, I felt like I had a timeline in my mind. I mean, I remember very young, I laugh now because it's like by 30, and I give air quotes now, that was the number I often thought about when I was younger around all these things I needed to have. And I have so many women in my life that, are not married or don't have children, but have incredibly full lives, have traveled the globe, have wonderful partners, beautiful homes, all of these other things. And I often think, maybe it wasn't as prominent in my mind at the time, but I look and I say, I probably was paying attention to that, even subconsciously. I met my husband. We dated for, several years, but I met him when I was 22. We got married when I was 28, had our daughter when I was 30. So, we had time together, but that's a very, it's a very traditional timeline. So I'm curious in your mind, like, were there anything outside of society, like, I don't know, family dynamics? You grew up in Tennessee, right?
Yep.
So like in the Southeast. So like, were there anything there that started that, or was it just this organic societal timeline that became present for you, or didn't?
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't really know. I definitely grew up in a very small town, very traditional family, amazing family that I'm super well connected with today. But I didn't travel when I was young. I felt my world was very small and very contained. Even when I go back to my hometown now, most of individuals that I graduated from high school with or knew from a younger age, there's a very specific time frame of what order they did everything, and many of them have not left and not done other things, which again is totally fine if that's their path and that's their journey. There was definitely something in me at 15, 16, 17 that knew I wanted something different. I didn't know what that was or what that looked like. But for me, I wanted to take some time right out of high school. I decided to take a gap year. I'll put air quotes around the gap year because it was meant to be a year that I took off because I graduated high school a year ahead of schedule. So I went overseas, I moved to Australia and worked for a nonprofit. And again, it was meant to be a 6-month stint. And I ended up working there almost for 5 years before I came back and went to school. So that was probably the first truly non-traditional, non-time oriented thing that I did, that definitely set me on a very different path. I think that's followed me since then.
Okay. So you are 16, 17 when you graduate? Because you said
17.
17. You're from small town Tennessee. You say, so was the gap year your idea or was it your parents?
It was kind of both. My mom and I sat down and talked about, and we had done the traditional, I was, like you said, super good grades in high school, very achievement oriented, and had gotten into a few different colleges that we were excited about. And I think my mom, in all her wisdom, recognized probably how immature I was, or maybe that a little bit of time in between would do me good. My mom also got married quite young and had children young. And so I think there was probably a part of her that thought, oh, there's an opportunity for her to do something a little bit different. Maybe I should encourage her. I honestly don't remember, though, if it was technically her idea or mine. I just remember the conversations of us talking about, hey, you've got some scholarships. Should we consider deferring them for a year, just to give you an opportunity to do something different? And so that was kind of the decision that we made, or what we settled on. I think there were some things tied to, if you do this, I will pay for more of your college. I don't know. There was something in there that as we progressed through it, it was definitely in my best interest to take this gap year and do some traveling. I had literally been on an airplane twice in my life. I'd flown to Chicago once and I'd flown to San Francisco once. So that was the extent of the world that I had seen. And I don't know how we picked Australia. I have very vivid memories of the flight to Australia. I had to spend a night in Sydney before I was able to get my connection to the city that I was ending up in. All, very worldly, world-changing things for this little 17-year-old that had left Tennessee like 3 times in her life.
I am like, I'm imagining myself at 17 and similar to you, wanted bigger things, wanted different things, but that probably would have terrified the hell out of me. Like, were you scared? Were you excited? Like, what was the mindset there? And I can only imagine the impact this has 17, on. These are such formative years.
Yeah, I don't remember being scared. I think I was definitely excited. And granted, I was going into a very safe environment. It was a religious nonprofit with a pretty good support network. So it wasn't like I was going backpacking solo through, the corners of the universe. There was definitely some structure around what I was doing. But the cool thing is that nonprofit was very global in nature. So for the next 6 months that morphed into a much longer time frame, I was surrounded by people from all over the world, different age groups, very different backgrounds, just things that looked very different than how I had grown up. And then I did a lot of traveling in the midst. So we spent a ton of time in Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, just did a lot of different kind of adventuring and a lot of relief and development fundraising, different types of aid projects during that season. So I think not only did it kind of open my eyes to what's out there and what the possibilities and options are, but it helped me also see that there's a world that doesn't live like I live, and there's needs and things that I can make an impact or make a difference. And I think that certainly wired me to believe for more, but also recognize that I had a moral obligation and an opportunity to make an impact bigger than myself.
So you are 22 when you come back to the States? Is that?
Yeah, I was 22 when I started college.
Okay, so you are in Australia. Curious, did that time abroad, whether it's, women that you worked with or maybe, just even societally, my understanding is that, in any exposure I have to more of the Eastern cultures, it's a very different way of living, way of working, way of being. And I'm curious, did any of that impact, the path you would then go on, or was it really just in that moment of your time abroad?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really know if I have a clear answer. I mean, there was certainly the exposure to different cultures and different ways of life. There's no way that can't shape you. I mean, I'll never forget the first time I like walked through a village in Thailand with people that had literally never seen Western people. They had never seen someone with my skin color or my hair color. So that feeling of there was people that would walk up and pet my hair because they'd never seen blonde hair. And those types of moments, there's definitely pivotal aspects within that where you realize the world is so much bigger than who you are and kind of what you've come from. So there's definitely lots of layers there. But I think it was also just me putting myself in an environment where I was allowed to grow up outside of the kind of culture and society that I had been in up to that point. It just gave myself a lot of freedom to think and process and make decisions and decide what the next steps needed to look like for me, as opposed to just, well, you graduate college or you graduate high school and then you go to college and then you meet your husband and then you get married and there's the track. So it gave me an opportunity to, I think, make decisions that were different.
Yeah, completely. I just think, I mean, honestly, that sense of self that comes when you go abroad, when you don't have your immediate support network of your family. It may have had a lot of structure as a nonprofit or as an organization, but there's not your family that you can reach out to or easily talk to. You're literally a world away. So time zones and the freedom of making your own decisions. I've been abroad a couple of times in my life, and even as a grown adult woman, I find those moments very humbling and also very strengthening when you see that you're able to, be put in a high stress or different environment and guide your way. There's something that comes from that I like wish for every young person, be it male or female.
So empowering, right? The other thing that I think that was really pivotal for me, and it's definitely since opened a ton of doors earlier in my career, is I got put into leadership opportunities really quickly. So I was leading teams, I was leading fundraising efforts. I mean, literally at 18, 19, 20, I was in charge of big stuff that I didn't know how to do. So I was outside of my comfort zone. I had always felt confident that I was smart enough to figure things out, but I hadn't really been put in situations where I had to figure stuff out, if we're honest. And so being in those types of environments, like literally we're stranded in a village in Indonesia. How do we get out? What should we do next? Who do I call? Like some of those types of moments, many that were much smaller and more insignificant, but those certainly built this sense of resiliency and grit within me to be like, oh, I can do hard things and emerge on the other side. And I think that shaped me into very much the leader and the professional that I became kind of in the years that followed.
I love that. In the book Untamed, Glennon Doyle has "We do hard things" or "We can do hard things." And that I have, I save that image on my phone. I have it, I look at it frequently because whenever I'm feeling that moment, and I just say, like, listen, people do it all the time. We can do hard things. Let's keep trucking. So
Glennon and I are going to be friends one day. I'm just sure of it.
That's half the reason I started this podcast. If I can become friends with Glennon Doyle and Brene Brown, consider me done. Just like I have made it. Yeah, exactly. So if you're listening, Glennon and Brene, this is why we're here. Okay. So you 22 come back from being abroad. How's the family doing? Are they like, is this like, they're like, holy shit, Catie's never coming back. She's living abroad the rest of our lives. Or are they like excited for you? What is the environment that you're coming back to when you come stateside?
So there was both. There was definitely an element of, particularly with my mom, who, remember, had very much encouraged this trip and time away and was all for it. Certainly it had many very clear conversations of what have I done? And I'm afraid you're never going to go to school. And coming from the environment in the small town that we came from, me going to college was very, very important. And so there was this huge fear factor that I may not go that route. So we'd had lots of very open conversations about it. So when I finally made the decision to come home and go to school, there was definitely an element of excitement. Yes, like we're getting there. So it was lots of positivity. That being said, though, my family had also traveled to spend time with me. Like my mom and I did a trip to New Zealand. She came and met me in Thailand once. Like we did some really cool trips overseas during the time that I lived there. She spent a Christmas with me in Australia. So there was some really cool memories and adventures through that season as well. So I think because of that, she was able to really understand some of the why behind what I was doing, why it was important, why it was significant for me personally. So yeah, it was all positive, but certainly at 22, there was this, I think on the family side as well as mine, like, okay, it's time, let's do this thing. Like I tend to be very fast paced, in case you can't tell by the speed of which I talk normally.
I feel it. Me too.
When I decide to do something, boom, we're doing it. Let's go. So once I was in and we were doing school, it was very much focused and surprise, I did a 4-year degree in 3 years because I thought I had 5 years to make up for. So I'll at least get one of them out of there.
So you finish high school early, you go abroad, you come back, you finish college in lesser amount of time. Is that self-driven? Are there like things like, what is that motivating factor? What is that part of you that says I'm going to accomplish and not just do it, but I'm going to do the damn thing. Like, I want to know where that comes from.
Yeah, if you figure it out, let me know.
Okay. Well,
I'm not really
mine comes from a father that really wanted me to always like hit the high mark. And so like mine is like so driven from that, like, right. We can get into therapy below the line stuff, but that's where mine comes from. So I'm curious is that, you know, I find it fascinating if it's self-driven because I know so many women that it is. And I think it's one of those things that I don't think you typically characterize women that way, right? Of like fast paced, like super goal oriented. But how many women do you and I know? You and I are included, are that way. Like I would say we're more the norm in my social circle, yet the societal norm isn't that picture of her being this overachiever. And so I struggle with that because my immediate reality is that, but when I look at the macro level of examples that my daughter's looking at or otherwise, I don't necessarily see that represented. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating topic of conversation because you're right. How, you know, you and I might be wired is very different than the societal norms. I don't know. For me, I do think that it was primarily self-driven. I don't see patterns of that in my broader family or my extended family. I just think I like to get things done quickly. And I do well when I have a lot on my plate. I tend to shut down. I get bored really easily. So if I don't feel challenged, if I'm not learning, or if I don't feel busy, I mean, there's all this talk about, you know, burnout and setting boundaries, and all of that stuff is super important. Mine is almost the opposite though. I find myself getting burnout or bored if I have too much like flex time, or I don't feel like I'm focusing on goals, things I want to accomplish, or things that I want to learn, or things that are uncomfortable or hard or challenging. So I don't know. I think there's just something in me that's wired to rise to the occasion or to shut down if the occasion doesn't interest me.
Yeah, that structure. I mean, and recognizing that about yourself, right? Because then that pushed you, I'm sure, into certain kind of jobs that you've had or environments that you've had. So let's fast forward. You come back, you finish university, you know, on track, if not faster, and then you get into the world of sales. And my understanding of sales before I got into it was very much like the Glengarry Ross, like always be closing. Like that was like my image in my head. And when I got into it, I mean, you and I talked about this over coffee. It's very different than that, and certainly in the world that you and I have lived in. What drew you to sales, and how has it been a career that suited you and allowed you maybe the life that you've built?
So it was definitely an accident. Most salespeople I
Classic.
know, yeah, especially sales executives that have been in it for years and years, they'll tell you they're totally an accidental salesperson. So I graduated with a degree in international affairs. I had done a business minor, but my assumption and thought at that point was that I would go back overseas and probably work for another nonprofit or potentially go to law school and study international law. Those were kind of the two things on my radar at that point. I literally had never had exposure to sales. I knew very little about business. I wasn't one of those kids that grew up like running a lemonade stand and selling things door to door. Like, I mean, my dad was an entrepreneur. He started a tire store and a mechanic shop, but that's literally the extent of my exposure to business as someone young. And so I just I don't think I was exposed to things that would help me realize coming out of college, like, oh, you might be really good at this. So I stumbled into an interview with, it was a Norwegian company called Meltwater, very global, very entry-level sales kind of driven. I could talk for hours about how interesting this company is, but it was an amazing place to accidentally land. The reason I was drawn to it because they had the word international in the title, international management trainee. That's what they called it, which was basically entry-level salesperson that's going to be doing cold calls and closing deals. But the thing that was fascinating is that they had offices all over the globe. So there was an opportunity to move into management quickly and an opportunity to move internationally if you wanted to go that path. So it was the only reason I pursued it. After the first interview, I wanted the job. I knew it was a good move for me, but I still thought it was going to be an in-between while I paid off some student debt, saved a little bit of money, figured out what was next, and decided whether or not law school was on the horizon. But if you would have asked me probably 3-4 weeks into the job, I was all in. Like, I was obsessed with selling. I loved it. I loved business. I was really lucky. It was a bit of a different time. Obviously, I guess one generation ago, if you will, in terms of like a
Sure.
sales lifestyle cycle, but we didn't have territories. We didn't have all this automation. I could sell into almost anyone. And so it was a really broad in business. We'll talk about a total addressable market, but just what companies can you sell to essentially.
Right.
And so the reality is I had an opportunity to learn about a ton of different aspects of business really quickly. And because, I mean, to your point, that whole goal oriented, I like to work hard, I like to focus on something and move quickly. It didn't bother me that I had an opportunity to work late every night. And I was just researching and learning all the time. So I fell in love with it pretty quickly. And then I ended up staying at that company for almost 5 years. I moved into management quickly. I ran the Atlanta location for the last, I guess, 3.5 years that I was with them. I did have opportunities to travel, spend a lot of time in some of our different global offices. So it was an amazing place to start my career.
Okay, so two things that come to mind as you were talking. I mean, this feels like for a young person, specifically a young woman building her career, this sounds kind of like the dream job, right? Like it's fast-paced environment, you're leading teams, you're traveling internationally. When you were younger, it could be little, or, going to college, whatever it is. When you were younger, is that what you imagined having it all would be? Like, when you started to paint that picture, younger Catie, what did that include? Was it professionally driven, or were there other components?
No, it wouldn't have even occurred to me to want that or to visualize that. Never. Even when I was finishing college, my version of what having it all at that point looked like, it wouldn't be where I am today because I just had not been exposed to that type of possibility or opportunity. So I would have had no idea.
You couldn't have even painted the picture because you didn't even know that world existed.
No, the same way that I could have never realized at 16 or 17 how much I would love traveling. I've been to 52 countries, so I've continued traveling since my time overseas, and it's a huge part of what motivates me and what I love. But remember, I hadn't left the country at 17, so I had never been exposed to that world. So I had no idea that was meant to be part of my story.
This to me is why representation and storytelling is so important, because I think about, you and we've had opportunities, we've had access to education. We are both, from my understanding, come from middle-class families. We're both white women in America. Like, there's so many things built into that. And we have access to these things and these stories, but what about the people who don't? And that to me is where it comes from, because similar to you, if you would ask me to paint a picture, my husband and I talk about this a lot. Life today is far better than I could have ever even imagined. And I would have, what a wasted opportunity, or what a loss if I hadn't been able to imagine this. Like, I just think of that so often. And that's been one of the driving forces behind this conversation.
I love it. And that's part of why I love leading and managing sellers today and managing them, especially earlier on in their career, because so many younger people that I work with, they just don't yet know what's possible, what they're capable of, how great they are at certain things. And we all have strengths and weaknesses. I have plenty of both, but helping, folks that are early in their career figure some of those things out and how they're wired and what they love to do. And typically it is, to your point, things that are maybe outside of the purview of what they've even thought. I never imagined I could be an enterprise seller. I never imagined I could, for some people, I never imagined I could make that much money, or I never imagined I could have this type of flexibility, or that I would have these types of choices. So being able to help expose people to that is really empowering, I think.
Totally. And so you talk about leading teams. You started very early on. I find that being a great leader or enjoying it, usually it comes from one of two things. Having a great leader yourself or mentor, or having a terrible one. So I'm curious, are either of those true for you?
I've been really, really blessed and lucky with a lot of the environments that I've worked in. Even back to that time that I spent overseas with the nonprofit, I had a phenomenal leader during that season who's still a very, very good friend of mine today. And so I think that laid some of the groundwork of why leadership is so important and what great leadership looks like. And of course, there's been a mix of great bosses and not so great bosses along the way. And I think the one thing I've tried to be purposeful of is just paying attention to the things that trigger me, what makes me motivated. And I mean, even to this day, paying attention to what types of conversations do I walk away from and be like, wow, I'm so inspired, or I feel like a better version of myself, versus wow, that was really deflating, or for some reason, like something's not jiving here, and just taking the time to process where that comes from. Because for most of us, I don't know, our reactions, I think, to good bosses and bad bosses, it's more about us and what triggers us and some of our own kind of intrinsic aspects. So just trying to pay attention to those things so that I'm then at least constantly being wired towards the side of, okay, how can I bring out the best in other people and make sure I'm paying attention to the things that I want people to be paying attention to with me.
That to me is so spot on. I had a great coach who I worked with, and we talked about anytime you're triggered or feel, to your point, super positive or super negative, something is interacting with your values. And so if it's a negative reaction, it's because they're compromised, and if it's positive, it's they're being fed, or they're flourishing. And so that self-reflection and self-awareness, I have found when I stopped to actually do that work, it made me a significantly better employee and leader, both of those. And I see how much it carries over into my personal life too, right? You have family dynamics that there's a moment of tension, and I'm very easily able to map it back to a value, and just naming that language. And I know a lot of, and I don't know, this may be just my own bias, I know a lot of women that are doing that work. I haven't had as many conversations with some of the men around me of doing that same work. And I am wondering if it's innately maybe feminine energy, that we're curious or empathetic about those things, or that we pay more attention to it because it's more important in our success. Like, if you weren't a great leader, then would you be able to rise? I don't know. Those are some of my hypotheses, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts there as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think for even the point that you just made about, do we have to do more to be better, I think is potentially very spot on. I've always been innately really curious. I think I've developed empathy more over time. That wasn't maybe as natural for me, particularly younger, earlier in my career. But I've always been insanely curious and tried to figure things out. So I think that has certainly morphed into wanting to figure myself out and how to bring out the best versions of myself. But there certainly is also an expectation of, if I want to, and sales is my world, and technology sales and SaaS sales in particular is very male driven, not always at the individual contributor role, but as you move into frontline leadership, sales director roles, VPs of sales, CROs, like literally the numbers get down into the single digits in terms of female representation as you're at the top levels. So I think there's certainly an understanding, at least for me personally, that if I want to lead big teams or have the opportunity for the big jobs, which I may or may not want, but I want to have the opportunity. So I'm going to need to be exceptional at what I do.
Ooh, that hits so hard for me. I think, that, to your point, the insanely curious, I can speak to my experiences. I can remember so often in my life, like especially younger, that curiosity I think can be exhausting to some people, like to always be asking why and doing that self-reflection. I have found as I've grown, it's served me really well, especially as I moved into leadership roles. I was leading a team and helping other people, be self-reflective. But even my husband sometimes is like, Jesus, woman, like, could you ask more questions? Like, let's just sit in silence. So I laugh about that, because I wonder, if those are innately traits that come more organically to women, and therefore they, there's some unique skills and talents. I'm always fascinated. My vision, my dream world is that women are the most sought after talent in the world, because I just think that there's so much complexity and innate skills that make us really wonderful at leading teams, and at sales specifically. It's all about people.
Yep.
And like curiosity and figuring them out and knowing what makes them tick and being empathetic. And it's my last team before I left the company I was at was all women sales leaders. And it was amazing. And it's not because I even did it by, I didn't do it by structure. I interviewed a ton of men and a ton of, different backgrounds, but those people continuously rose to the top, especially in complex sales where there was so much nuance. And so that was one of my biggest, rah-rah moments of just seeing the power of what it, what it could be in that world.
I love that so much. And curiosity is literally the number one thing I look for in sellers and managers that I hire. And it doesn't have to be female, certainly. And I have seen both men and women that do not naturally bring so much curiosity to the table, and then others that are just wired that way. And to your point, when you're talking about complex sales or managing teams that are orchestrating complex sales, there's so many moving parts. It's figuring out the people and how they're wired and what motivates them. It's figuring out the business. How does that business make money? What do they care about? What's on the trajectory? Like being able to dissect things that you may not understand. And then it's the product that you're selling. Like, are you actually curious about how this thing works? What does it do for customers? What are the pros, the cons? Like being able to tie those three layers together and genuinely be interested, not just trying to learn it because you have to learn it to sell it. It's a game changer.
Oh, I love that. I'm right there with you. Okay, so we've covered off on professional and how you've rocked that world, and I want to talk about on a personal trajectory. So you're killing it, like, right? You have this great role. You're a leader in a top organization. You live in Atlanta, but I understand that you spent time in New York, or we're splitting your time. So you're in two amazing markets. Like, talk to me about the other side of your life.
In terms of the personal side, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It's funny when we were chatting before, like, this is not something I normally talk about on podcasts or anything super publicly, but totally happy to share. So obviously feel ultra blessed with what I've been able to accomplish professionally. It's definitely still a work in progress, lots to be done still, but it's been just an amazing journey. On the personal side, I'm probably even more blessed than anything I could ever orchestrate, professionally. I met my now husband when I was finishing college. We didn't start dating for another year or so after, but we met through friends. He's an amazing man named Gustavo. He's from Brazil. So I was part of this really, hence the international trend. I made this great group of international friends during college, and just really lucky to be able to tie a lot of my overseas experience into my journey in Atlanta. So once Gus and I first finally started dating, we were engaged 6 months later, married 6 months later, similar time frame as you. I think we got married I was 28. Very early in my career. I was 1 year into that first sales job that I had talked about when we married, or maybe 2 years in by that point. But I just literally could not have found a better partner, like the most incredible person that you could imagine, in every way. Literally anyone that knows him, everyone in our friend group, like, Gus is just one of those people that walks into the room and people are like, they gravitate towards him. Like, he just lights up a room everywhere he goes.
I wish that the listeners could see your face, because you were lighting up right now, just like talking about him and
Yeah.
this partnership you have with him. It's
No,
amazing.
he's just lovely in so many ways. The other thing we lead a small group of newlyweds. So we talk a lot about marriage and what makes a great marriage and how to build one, pros and cons and all the mistakes we've made along the way, because we certainly have made those as well. But the one thing that I think we're really good at is we're both very, very kind to one another. And so this sense of, like, what does it mean to respond with kindness, to have this gentle sense of, hey, I don't really understand what you're looking for here, but I feel like something's not aligning, and being able to have conversations that aren't coming from a place of anger or reaction. Gus is really good at that, much better than me. He's like 10 times more selfless and patient and kind than I am. But I've learned lots from him and become
Totally.
many of those things. So we've been married a long time, had an amazing journey, have done a lot of traveling. To your point, we were splitting our time between New York and Atlanta pre-COVID. We had an adorable apartment up there that I just had to let go of.
Rest in peace, beautiful apartment in New York.
Oh, beautiful. We're hoping for another day when, another season that we will need to, or have an opportunity to spend more time up there.
Yeah.
Gus is an enterprise AE, so works remote, but travels, or did travel a lot as well. So most of his family is all in Brazil, so we spend a lot of time down there as well. So it's just, been a really fun, interesting journey. I think one thing that is probably interesting for your listeners when we think about this concept of having it all, or what the one trajectory needs to look like, is that we still don't have children. So I'm in my late 30s. Gus is in his early 40s. So we don't have kids yet. The plan is still to have or adopt one or two, but we've purposely made decisions around doing that at a different time frame or a different season that is typically normal, or more average, if you will.
Yeah, we're giving giant air quotes anytime we say normal here, people,
normal,
there is no normal.
The things that maybe people would have expected of us was
Sure.
certainly to have kids a little earlier in our journey together. And it's interesting, and some of that was by choice and some of that not as much by choice, but it's very interesting now from my perspective to look back and think, I actually wouldn't change any of that, because of what we've been able to build as a couple, the careers we've been able to build, the friend groups we've been able to build. Like, there's just a lot of positives that I see around us that would have been a different journey or a different story for us if we had gone, a different route in terms of building our family earlier. So I think we're going to have, an amazing story that'll look different again 10 and 15 years from now, with, little ones running around and us trying to figure out how to find enough energy to keep up with them. But definitely a different trajectory, and one that I'm super stoked that we chose.
Amazing. And have you guys was that always an organic conversation for you all to say, this is, we're on the same time track of, we're going to wait later? Or were there times that you had to really, work to discuss that and make sure that you were aligned?
So it was talked about, obviously, before we were married.
Sure.
I was much more sure that I wanted to wait longer to have kids. Gus wasn't as strongly opinionated in either direction. So he was very open to, if I had said, year one of our marriage, let's have a baby, he would have been on board. But he was also totally fine with, let's take our time, do this when it makes sense. He was in an interesting phase when he moved to the US. He had to start over, he had to learn English, finally went to school. Like his career trajectory is also
that's brutal too.
Yeah. So it was good timing for us to be able to take a step back and not feel like we were in a rush at that point. We also talked very early on about the fact that we were both open to adopting children. We kind of thought if you would have asked us 10 years ago what our, picture perfect plan was, we would have one baby and adopt one baby. Like that was just kind of always discussed as something that we would love to do. So knowing that adoption was something that we were both open to, and timing was something we were both flexible on, I think is what created that ability for us to give ourselves space in that area.
I think that's so beautiful. Like I said, I met my husband fairly young. I look now, I was 22 when we first met, and we did date for a long time, but I think 22, I mean, that's a baby and in so many ways, and how much we both have grown. He's 4 years, almost 5 years older than me. But during that time, we had to have a lot of intentional growth, right? And I think that you guys saying that, you've been partners and married now, and to be able to grow together. And I think that when it comes to having it all, it's not just women being in their own bubble saying like, rah, rah, we want to have it all. It's also the environment that they occupy. It's the partnerships that they have. It's the family that surrounds them that also enable that all to come true. And I've rarely talked to a woman that is brave enough to define what it means to have it all for her that doesn't have a really wonderful support system. And that comes in a lot of ways, right? That can come in partnership, a husband, wife, but usually the partnership is one of the biggest things that I find creates strength and some of that bravery to do that. And hearing you say that, I mean, like I said, your face lit up when you talked about Gus.
And the people we share our lives with are everything. So it's not just that one partner, but the people we surround ourselves with absolutely define who we are and who we will become. So I think it's super important.
Yeah. So you said that you all, you lead a group of newlyweds. I find that there comes a lot of strength when you tell your own stories to other people, right? Like there's a lot of self-reflection and learning that comes through that. I found that even just doing this podcast of like reflecting on, when are the times that I've chosen it versus just been handed to me. Has that played a role in how you guys now communicate or look at your own partnership?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's easy for us once you're married for a little while. I think we can get really lazy, like, especially if you've got a relatively good marriage, like you can just kind of go through the motions and like, we're happy, but we're not really working on anything. So I think being involved in our small group has definitely helped us keep working on things. I mean, we read books about, building financial stability and how to have conversations about money. We have, we read books on learning styles and how to ask better questions. And like, there's just all these different layers of things that are super important for these kids that are, year 1, year 2 of their marriage. Yeah. But then it allows us to have really interesting conversations, how we've been married 12 years. So 12 years in, like to have a conversation just last week, we're like, oh, I didn't know that about we were digging into people's backgrounds and understanding how the environments we were raised in impacts how we process emotion and how we interact. And I learned new things about Gus's family and his childhood. And we talk a lot. So I think I know him pretty well, but there's always more to uncover and unpack. And we certainly wouldn't have that layer of depth, I don't think, in those types of conversations if we weren't proactively trying to, lead and influence others.
Totally. My husband and I, we just have a lot of life going on right now. So he works full time. He's getting his MBA. I've recently left my job, trying to start something new. We have a daughter, so there's just like coronavirus also, like there's a lot happening.
Just say 2020. That's literally
2020 is like all I need to say. Right. And and things are going good, but we have a therapist, and the therapist, like some weeks when things are going good, we're like, do we really need to meet her? And to your point, even when things are awesome, we walk away from that of like, that was a worthwhile investment. The most important part of all of this that works is each other. So the fact that we just spent an hour together, even if it was just a good conversation, like I'll take that. So I think it's awesome to have that reflection. And I think it can also be really difficult when life is good and busy to spend the time to slow down. So
yeah, for sure.
I feel you there. All right. So any pressures that you got? So you said that you and Gus have been on the same page. Did the families start hitting you guys like a year into marriage? Were they like, okay, Catie, where are the kids? I mean, I got that. So I'm just curious if you
1,000%. Yeah. Not just family, friends,
coworkers.
Yeah, I've already talked about how amazing Gus is. So I think there's like literally hundreds of people that have been dreaming of the day that Gus becomes a father. So like there's like just cheerleaders everywhere. I think as some of them have been more involved in our journey, people have backed off a little bit. But yeah, there's always external pressure for sure.
Totally. Have you guys ever felt that? Like, or is it you guys staying tunnel vision on what your vision is?
Oh no, we definitely still feel the pressure, and I feel the pressure to, create the babies for, the amazing parents that we have, all of those things for sure. I think that's normal.
Totally. I think that one of the most fascinating points that I've taken away from our coffee and now our conversation, also over coffee, because why not, is that there's a sense within you that you have a lot of confidence and self-worth that has come through at the very beginning. And I think that each decision you've made, whether it's been through academics or a partner or professionally, and this radiated when you and I met, is that all of it's been intentional. And I'm sure, every single path hasn't been one that you've sat down and said, what's next? But it seems like you've played an active role in your life. And I think that's something that so many of us sometimes maybe don't feel like we have the ability to, like, right? Life seems sometimes laid out, or that we have to jump right in. And I'm so grateful that you're telling the story of what that sounds like. Your mom played a large role in that at the beginning, saying, hey, I had one path, maybe yours can look a little different, exposure to different communities. But then it seems like it's also been innate within you. So I'm so grateful that you not only are telling this story, but it seems like you radiate that in your life, whether it's through teams or your small group, friendships, etc.
I hope so. I mean, it's definitely my goal. I just think that for any of us, we're not the victims of our environments, and our environments might be amazing, but we're not powerless within that to make choices and make decisions and define what those things need to look like for us. And I think I've certainly seen this in women that I've talked with, that sometimes we can just be really passive and sort of get in this place of where we think we have to just sort of accept what we see around us, even if it's things like inequality, lack of diversity and equity. Like we just sort of think that at times we have to suck it up and deal with it and stay in our bubble. And I just don't think that's the case. I think that we have more power than we know.
More power than we know. I love that. That's such a good one to end on. All right. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire, because I just am fascinated with the women I get to speak with, and I always want to know. So, the best part of being a woman is?
Wow. I honestly don't know. I've never thought of it that way. I love so many things about my life. So I don't know, being able to be married to Gus, that's the best part of being a woman.
Oh, love that. Gus, listen to this, man. You're getting all the love today. Who do you admire?
Oh, so many people. You've already mentioned Brene Brown. I just started listening to her Daring Leadership podcast, and I'm clearly obsessed. So I think that she is phenomenal. I admire my mom a ton. I've mentioned her many times. I have a really great extended family as well. My grandmother is just about to turn 92 and is just a strong, strong woman in so many ways.
Hey, so Grandma, I hope she gets to listen to this.
She might be offended by the name of the podcast, so we'll see if we share it with her.
I know. We'll blur it out and just call it the It All podcast.
I'll give her some, high notes. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of folks in my immediate family circle that I admire. But if I'm picking someone more celebrity-esque, it would be Brene.
I totally agree. I swear, like whenever Brene takes me to church. Like that's how I feel when I listen to her. I feel like she just gives me what I need to fill my soul. What is a simple pleasure that makes you really happy?
Drinking wine.
What kind?
So I love all things red, but I love like a big Brunello, that type of like big red is my fave.
Love it. Love it. Perfect time of year for it. We're going into that season.
Although it's pretty much been all of 2020, so I should probably be toning back on the wine, but we're just going to go with it.
Hey, it's like you said, pardon me, it's 2020. All things are fair. When my power is shaken, I
look inward.
What are you reading right now?
So I just finished a book called, oh crap, it's sitting literally like right next to me. Turn the Ship Around. It's all about basically turning followers into leaders. So it's a different philosophy of leadership and how do you empower your people to basically be empowered to lead versus take orders.
I love that. As a leader, to have other leaders within your organization makes your job so much more fulfilling.
Yeah.
What's the best advice you've ever been given?
Gosh, there's been a lot. Be brave.
Hmm.
Do hard things. There you go. Be brave and do hard things.
Well, you do both of those very well. Everything I've gotten from our conversation. All right. And we're going to close it out. If you can tell your younger self one thing, what would it be?
You'll be amazed with what you can accomplish.
I'm going to let that just linger there. Catie, this has been a wonderful way to spend my morning. I've had my coffee and I've got my cup full in so many ways from this conversation. You inspire me. I'm grateful that I got to meet you and that we get to share your story with the rest of the community here. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Casey. I loved it. It was a great conversation and so good to meet you as well.
Oh my gosh. I tell you people, if you can do a distanced outdoor coffee, it does amazing things for you. All right. This is the Fuck It All podcast, where we are modern women talking about how we redefine what it means to have it all. I had Catie Ivey on today, and I'll be seeing you next week. Take care.